welcome back to Strange Epochs. I'm Sean Spainhour, and this is the show where we take one strange, true, documented moment from somewhere in the long and bewildering span of human history, and we sit with it. New episodes every Tuesday. Sources are always in the episode description. This week, we are going to medieval Italy. The year is 1325. The place is the Emilia-Romagna region of northern Italy, a flat, fertile, bitterly contested stretch of land between two cities that have hated each other for 200 years and are about to hate each other even more. The cities are Bologna and Modena. They are separated by about 40 kilometers of Italian countryside, a distance that in 1325 takes perhaps a day to cross on horseback. They are close enough to trade with each other, to intermarry with each other, to know each other's names and histories and grievances intimately. They are also close enough that when one of them does something to humiliate the other, the humiliation lands with full force and demands a response. This episode is about what happens when that response is a war. Specifically, it is about what happens when two medieval Italian city-states mobilize thousands of soldiers, draw in allies from across the region, march across the plains of Emilia-Romagna, fight a battle in which approximately 2,000 men are killed, and do all of this, at least according to the legend that has attached itself to the conflict for 700 years because someone stole a wooden bucket, from a well. The bucket still exists. It is in Modena right now, in the basement of the Torre della Ghirlandina, the city's medieval bell tower. Bologna has never gotten it back. Bologna has been trying to get it back for 700 years. Modena has never returned it. This story is funny. It is also, as with most things that look funny from a distance, considerably more complicated and considerably darker when you get close. We will get close. Let's begin. Bologna, a night in 1325. The exact date is disputed. Some sources say July, some say it happened after the main battle in November, but the night itself has a specific quality that the legend has preserved for 7 centuries. It is dark. The city is sleeping. The city has been asleep before, on hundreds of such nights, and will be asleep again on hundreds more. This is a city used to its own continuity, its own permanence, its own importance. The university is here. The towers are here, more than 200 of them at the height of the tower building craze, though many have already come down by 1325, their owners having made their point or run out of money or simply tired of the maintenance. The streets are quiet, the way medieval streets get quiet after dark, when the curfew bells have rung and the candles have been snuffed, and the city withdraws into itself until morning. Bologna, in 1325, is a city of perhaps 50,000 people, one of the largest and wealthiest in northern Italy. It has one of the oldest universities in the world, the University of Bologna, founded in 1088, which by the 14th century has become the preeminent center of legal education in Europe. It has towers, hundreds of them, the skyscrapers of the medieval Italian city, built by wealthy families as symbols of their power and their willingness to spend money on things that are tall and pointy and visible from a distance. It has walls, thick and serious walls, the kind of walls that a prosperous city builds when it has enemies and the money to discourage them. Tonight, those walls are not doing their job. A small group of Modenese soldiers has gotten through. No one knows exactly how a gate left unguarded, a section of wall with a convenient handhold, a guard who was asleep or bribed or simply not where he was supposed to be. However they got in, they are in. They are moving through the dark streets of their enemy's city, past the shuttered shops and the sleeping households, with a specific and almost absurd objective. They are looking for a bucket. They find it. It is at a public well near the center of the city, an ordinary wooden bucket, the kind used thousands of times a day to draw water from 1,000 wells in 1,000 towns across northern Italy. It has no particular history, no particular value. It is a bucket. They take it. They make their way back out of the city the way they came, carrying their prize. They return to Modena. When the Bolognese discover the bucket is missing, they are furious. When they discover who took it, they are incensed. When they demand its return and are refused with, by some accounts, considerable Modenese amusement at the demand, they are done with diplomacy. Bologna declares war on Modena over a bucket. This is the legend. The truth, as we will see, is messier and bloodier and in some ways more interesting. But the legend has survived 700 years for a reason. And the bucket, the actual bucket, the one at the center of all of this, is still in Modena. Bologna still wants it back. The War of the Bucket did not happen because of a bucket. Let me be clear about that from the beginning, because the legend is so good that it tends to swallow the history, and the history is genuinely worth understanding. The bucket was, at most, the final provocation in a conflict that had been building for 200 years and was going to explode into open warfare with or without any wooden pails being involved. To understand the War of the Bucket, you have to understand medieval Italy, which is a subject that rewards attention. Medieval Italy was not a country, it was a landscape, a dense, complicated, extraordinarily violent landscape of independent city-states, each with its own government, its own army, its own laws, its own pride, and its own set of enemies that it had been fighting for as long as anyone could remember. Florence and Siena, Venice and Genoa, Milan and everyone. The peninsula was, as one historian has put it, a school for conflict, where the specific art of political and military rivalry was practiced, with a sophistication and a relentlessness that would eventually produce the first modern concepts of statecraft and diplomacy, not because the Italians were especially peaceful, but because they had been fighting each other for so long that they developed elaborate theories about how to do it more efficiently. Laid over this landscape of local rivalries was a second layer of conflict that was both older and larger, the struggle between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. These names have passed into English as a shorthand for pointless factional conflict, the original Hatfields and McCoys, the original team rivalry that nobody can fully explain anymore. But in medieval Italy, they meant something specific and politically serious. The Ghibellines were the faction that supported the Holy Roman Emperor and his claims over Italy. The Guelphs were the faction that supported the Pope. This divide had its origins in the 11th century in a specific dispute between Pope Gregory VII and Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV over who had the right to appoint bishops. A question that sounds dry and procedural until you understand that medieval bishops controlled enormous amounts of land, money, and political influence, and that whoever got to appoint them effectively controlled the political and economic life of a significant portion of Europe. Over the following centuries, the Guelph-Ghibelline conflict spread from that original jurisdictional dispute into a general framework within which every political question in northern Italy was interpreted. Which city controlled which castle? Guelph-Ghibelline question. Who got to tax which road? Guelph-Ghibelline question. Which merchant family would control the wool trade in which region? Guelph-Ghibelline question. The original theological content of the dispute had largely evaporated by the 13th century, but the factional identities remained, attached to cities and families and military alliances that continued to fight under those banners long after the underlying questions had shifted entirely. The city-states of northern Italy in the 13th and 14th centuries were, by almost any measure, among the most dynamic political entities in the medieval world. They were wealthy beyond the standards of the time, driven by trade and banking, and the manufacture of luxury goods. They were culturally sophisticated, producing art and architecture and scholarship at a rate that would eventually flower into the Renaissance. And they were almost continuously at war with each other, not because they were unusually bloodthirsty, but because the specific conditions of their political existence made conflict structurally almost inevitable. Each city was jealous of its autonomy. Each city controlled a territoria contado, a surrounding agricultural hinterland whose exact boundaries were always contested by neighboring cities. Each city needed to control the roads that connected it to its trading partners, and those roads inevitably passed through territory that other cities also claimed. Each city had a population of merchants and artisans who needed access to raw materials and markets that were controlled, in whole or in part, by rivals. The structural incentives for conflict were constant and multiple, and the institutional mechanisms for resolving disputes peacefully were fragile and unreliable. War, in this world, was not an aberration. It was a regular feature of the political landscape, managed and limited as much as possible, but never eliminated. Bologna was Guelph. It was a wealthy, proud, papally aligned city that considered itself the intellectual capital of northern Italy, not without reason, given the university, which by 1325 had been training lawyers and scholars for over 2 centuries. Bologna had the money, the connections, and the self-regard of a city that was used to being important. Modena was Ghibelline. It was a smaller city, less wealthy, less prominent, but militarily capable and possessed of the particular chip on its shoulder that smaller cities develop when they exist in the shadow of larger, richer, more important neighbors. Modena's pride was of the aggressive kind, the kind that needs proving regularly and visibly against people who would otherwise look down on it. By 1325, the Guelph-Ghibelline divide had become, in many ways, more a matter of inherited identity than of active theological conviction. Few of the soldiers who would fight at Zappolino had strong views about whether the Pope or the Holy Roman Emperor had the right to appoint the Bishop of Modena. What they had were loyalties to their city, to their faction, to the specific network of alliances and obligations that determined who their allies were and who their enemies were. The labels had stuck long after the original argument had transformed into something else entirely, which is how political identities usually work. The Guelph-Ghibelline conflict of 1325 was, in its immediate practical terms, a conflict about territory, about trade routes, about which families controlled which castles and which cities held which roads. But it was conducted under banners that still read Pope and Emperor, because those banners were what people knew how to follow. Between them, the two cities had been fighting, raiding, negotiating, and fighting again for generations. Territory changed hands. Castles were built and destroyed. Ambassadors were sent, and sometimes returned, and sometimes did not. By 1325, the relationship between Bologna and Modena had accumulated roughly 2 centuries of specific, documented grievance, including the seizure by Bologna of the Modenese towns of Bazzano and Savigno in 1296, confirmed by papal sanction the same year, a humiliation that Modena had not forgotten and had been waiting to answer. Honor, in the political culture of the medieval Italian city-state, was not a sentiment or a personal virtue. It was a political resource. A city that absorbed an insult without response was a city that had demonstrated its inability to protect itself. That demonstration would be read by every potential ally and every potential enemy in the region as evidence of weakness. It would invite further insults, further encroachments, further tests of whether the city would respond or absorb. The logic of honor in this world was not irrational. It was a rational response to a security environment in which the willingness to retaliate was one of the primary things that kept you safe. A city that was known to fight back was a city that attracted fewer attacks. A city that was known to swallow insults was a city that attracted more. This logic does not make wars good or necessary. It does explain why they happen so readily in environments where the alternative, looking weak, has real and serious consequences. The immediate trigger for the War of the Bucket was not, in fact, a bucket. It was a castle. In September of 1325, the strategic Bolognese castle of Monteveglio was betrayed to Modena by malcontents within its garrison. Two Bolognese castellans, who were responsible for the betrayal, were subsequently captured and decapitated, which tells you something about how seriously medieval Italian city-states took the security of their fortifications. But the castle was gone. Modena held it, and Bologna, which had been enduring raids and provocations across its frontier all summer. Bolognese chronicles describe Modenese forces laying waste to fields and villages in the sections between the canals throughout the summer and autumn of 1325, decided that Monteveglio was the provocation that finally required a formal military response. The summer of 1325 had been one of sustained and escalating violence on the Bolognese-Modenese frontier. In July, Bolognese forces had entered Modenese territory and burned fields, a tactic known as chevauchée, the deliberate destruction of agricultural land and property, intended to impoverish the enemy's rural population and demonstrate the inability of the enemy's government to protect them. In August, a Bolognese force spent 2 weeks ravaging more Modenese lands. In September, Mantua joined in on the Bolognese side, adding its own raids to the campaign of destruction. These were not formal declarations of war. They were the slow, grinding escalation of a conflict that had not yet reached its crisis point but was clearly heading there. Each act of destruction generating the obligation for a response, each response generating the obligation for a counter-response, in the familiar logic of a feud that no one had the political space to stop. Bologna called its allies. The Guelph network across northern Italy was activated. Florence and the cities of Romagna sent contingents. By November, Bologna had assembled an army that the chronicles put at approximately 32,000 men, 30,000 infantry, and 2,000 cavalry, a force that dwarfed anything Modena could put in the field. Modena, facing this enormous force, could muster approximately 7,000 men, 5,000 infantry, and 2,000 cavalry. They were outnumbered more than 4 to 1. They fought anyway. The Battle of Zappolino took place on November 15, 1325, in the rolling hills between the two cities, at the foot of a small castle near the village of Zappolino. The Bolognese army had marched out from its city with considerable confidence, 32,000 men, with allies from Florence and the Romagna heading to crush a Modenese force less than a quarter its size. From a strictly numerical standpoint, the outcome should have been predetermined. It was not. The Modenese army was led by Passerino Bonacolsi, the Lord of Mantua, who controlled Modena at the time under the aegis of the Ghibelline alliance. Bonacolsi was an experienced military commander, and he understood that his only hope of victory lay not in matching the Bolognese blow for blow across open ground, but in using his cavalry, his best asset, better trained and more disciplined than the Bolognese horse, to create confusion and disrupt the enemy's formations before they could bring their numerical advantage to bear. The Bolognese army, for all its size, had significant weaknesses. Its infantry was composed largely of citizen militiamen who were available and willing, but were not professional soldiers. They were haphazardly armed and poorly coordinated. The Bolognese chronicles describe their own forces with a certain embarrassed honesty. A rabble, they say, headed by their podesta, overconfident and poorly disciplined. 30,000 men who believe they have already won before the first sword is drawn are not 30,000 men at their best. At sunset on November 15th, the armies met. The battle lasted approximately 2 hours. In those 2 hours, the Modenese cavalry executed a feint, a false river crossing, that drew part of the Bolognese force out of position and created the gap in their lines that the Modenese infantry exploited. The Bolognese, caught off balance, could not bring their numbers to bear effectively. The citizen militia that made up the bulk of their army, confronted with a disciplined and aggressive Modenese assault, did what citizen militias under pressure often do. They broke. The chronicles describe the scene with the particular vividness that medieval Italian writers brought to accounts of military disaster. The Bolognese foot soldiers, realizing that the battle had turned against them, threw down their weapons and ran. The Modenese cavalry pursued. The road back to Bologna was littered with abandoned equipment, with men who had tripped and been trampled, with the specific detritus of an army in flight. The survivors reached the walls of their city and poured through the gates. The gates were shut. The pursuit stopped. Outside those gates, the Modenese cavalry circled and the infantry came up behind them, and the victorious army stood in the November afternoon and looked at the city that had sent 32,000 men to crush them. The city that had thought this was going to be easy. The city that was now watching from behind its walls while 7,000 Modenese soldiers organized a race outside its gates to celebrate. The rout was complete. The Bolognese army fled back toward its city, leaving behind weapons, supplies, and approximately 2,000 dead on the field. 26 notable citizens of Bologna were captured and imprisoned in Modena, where they would remain for 11 weeks. The Modenese followed the fleeing army all the way to the walls of Bologna. They did not attempt a siege. They were 7,000 men against a fortified city, and sieges require time and resources that Bonicolsi did not have in surplus. But they did something that, in the specific cultural logic of medieval Italian city-state rivalry, may have been more damaging than a siege. They organized a palio. A palio was a race, a competitive public spectacle, the medieval Italian equivalent of a festival or a parade. To hold a palio outside the walls of a city whose army you had just destroyed was to perform your victory in the most public and humiliating way possible. It was the equivalent of dancing on your enemy's doorstep while they watched from inside, unable to respond. The chronicles record that the Modenese organized their celebrations specifically, as the Latin text puts it, ad aeternam Bologniensium scandalum, to the eternal shame of Bologna. To understand why this was such an effective insult, you have to understand what a palio meant in the civic culture of medieval Italy. The palio was not just a race. It was a public ritual, a festival, that expressed the collective identity and pride of the city that held it. Bologna held its own palio. Most Italian cities did. To hold a palio in your enemy's territory, outside their walls while their defeated army cowered inside, was not just mockery. It was a specific usurpation. It was the performance of civic vitality in a space that belonged to your enemy. It was saying, your city is now ours, even if we do not want it. We can do in your doorstep what you do inside your walls. We have taken your dignity, and we are using it to entertain ourselves. And then, before they left, they took a bucket from a well outside the city gate. This is the most likely version of events. The bucket was a trophy of victory, not the cause of the war. The Modenese did not sneak into Bologna in the night and steal a bucket, thereby triggering a conflict. They won a decisive battle, humiliated their enemy outside their own walls, and took a bucket from a well on their way home as a symbol of their contempt. The bucket was the last insult in a long sequence of insults, the final punctuation mark on a victory that the Modenese intended to be remembered. They intended correctly. Back in Modena, the bucket was installed in the Torre della Ghirlandina, the great bell tower of the cathedral, where it remained as a symbol of Modenese triumph and Bolognese humiliation. The fact that the trophy was a bucket, a humble domestic agricultural object rather than a sword or a banner or a piece of armor was, of course, the point. The Modenese were not just saying we won, they were saying, we took this worthless thing from you and you couldn't stop us, and now It will hang above your heads forever. It was, as insults go, a good one. It worked. Bologna has been trying to get the bucket back for 700 years. The peace negotiations that followed the Battle of Zappolino were, by medieval standards, relatively quick. In January of 1326, the two sides signed an armistice. Modena agreed to return the castle of Monteviglio and other captured properties to Bologna, receiving payment in return. The chronicles suggest the return was essentially a ransom transaction, with the specific sums handled privately by Bonacolsi. The political situation in the region was restored, more or less, to what it had been before the conflict began. The power balance shifted somewhat in Modena's favor, and the Ghibelline alliance in the region was strengthened, but there was no dramatic redrawing of the political map. What was not returned was the bucket. The peace treaty did not require its return. Bologna, which had gone to war over a castle and lost, was in no position to demand the return of a piece of kitchenware. Modena kept it, and the bucket became, over the following centuries, something more than a war trophy. It became a story. In 1622, almost 300 years after the Battle of Zappolino, an Italian poet named Alessandro Tassoni published a mock epic poem called La Secchia Rapita, the rape of the bucket, in the old sense of rape as seizure or theft. Tassoni was a satirist with a sharp eye for the absurdities of political conflict, and he found in the War of the Bucket exactly the kind of material that a good satirist treasures. A serious conflict with a ridiculous object at its center, a story that could be told in the style of Homer while making the whole business of war look simultaneously heroic and idiotic. The poem was a significant literary success. It went through multiple editions in the 17th century and was translated across Europe. It was later adapted into an opera in 1772 by Antonio Salieri, the same Salieri who was famously and largely inaccurately cast as Mozart's nemesis, which means that the stolen bucket of Modena contributed in a roundabout way to the operatic career of one of the most unfairly maligned composers in the history of music. Tassoni's poem is interesting not just as a literary artifact, but as evidence of what the War of the Bucket meant to later Italian culture. Within 3 centuries of the conflict, it had become a joke, a famous and beloved joke, but a joke. The thing that the Bolognese had experienced as genuine humiliation and genuine loss had been metabolized by time and literature into a kind of affectionate absurdity. This is one of the ways that history copes with its own violence, by finding, eventually, the comedy in it. The title La Secchia Rapita is itself a literary joke. Rapita, from the same root as the English word rapture, was the word used in classical Latin for the seizure of a significant object. Virgil used it. The title of the poem is simultaneously invoking the grandeur of the classical tradition and applying it to a bucket. The contrast between the epic register and the mundane object is the whole joke, executed in the title and then sustained across thousands of lines of heroic verse. Gods and angels take sides in the conflict. The souls of ancient warriors descend to advise the living. The fate of empires hangs in the balance. The stakes are a wooden bucket from a well in Bologna. The poem did something specific to the historical memory of the conflict. It transformed an event that had been, for the people who lived through it, a genuine military and political crisis, into a permanent emblem of the absurdity of war. The people who fought at Zappolino did not find it funny. The 2,000 dead certainly did not. But by 1622, it had become possible to write an epic poem about a bucket, and have educated Europeans across the continent read it with pleasure because enough time had passed that the real suffering had become invisible, and what remained was the shape of the story. This is one of the things that comedy does to history. It preserves the outline while letting the weight drain away. But I want to stay with the violence for a moment, because the joke version of the story tends to elide it. 2,000 men died at Zappolino in 2 hours. 2,000 men in 2 hours on a November afternoon in the hills of Emilia-Romagna, killed with swords and spears and the hooves of cavalry horses in a battle that lasted roughly as long as it takes to watch a film. They were not abstract casualties. They were farmers and tradesmen and soldiers with names and families and specific histories. They died for reasons that their city-states politicians had deemed sufficient. Whether those reasons included a bucket or not, they died in large numbers in a short time, and the story that gets told about why tends to be considerably lighter than the event it describes. The War of the Bucket is often cited as an example of medieval Italian political absurdity, proof that the city-states of the period were so consumed by local pride and factional rivalry that they would go to war over, literally, anything. And there is something to this reading. The Guelph Ghibelline conflict by 1325 had been running for 250 years and had long since lost most of its original theological content. What remained was the faction, the identity, the specific pleasure of having an enemy against whom your own city could define itself. Bologna was Guelph, partly because it was not Modena. Modena was Ghibelline, partly because it was not Bologna. The bucket, whether stolen before or after the war, was a perfect symbol of this dynamic. It had no intrinsic value, but it was theirs, and taking it was taking something. There is a broader pattern here that the War of the Bucket illustrates with unusual clarity. Large conflicts rarely start for large reasons. They start for small ones, for the specific, local, immediate irritant that breaks a surface tension that has been building for years, or decades, or centuries. The assassination of an archduke, a telegram sent in the wrong tone, a border incident that, in a different political climate, would have been resolved by a strongly worded diplomatic note. The War of the Bucket is the medieval Italian version of this pattern. A conflict with very deep roots and very long preparation, set off by the most proximate and ridiculous trigger available. The specific military lessons of the Battle of Zappolino are not nothing. The victory of a 7,000-man force over an army more than 4 times its size was not an accident. The Modenese cavalry was genuinely better than the Bolognese cavalry. Bonacolsi's tactical use of the feigned crossing was a real piece of military craft. The Bolognese dependence on a large citizen militia that had never been properly trained or disciplined was a genuine vulnerability that the Modenese exploited. There is an argument to be made, and it has been made, by military historians writing about the Italian city-state wars of this period, that Zappolino is a small but instructive example of quality defeating quantity, of professional soldiers outperforming amateurs, of tactical intelligence overcoming numerical advantage. These lessons were learned, in various forms, by the condottieri, the professional mercenary captains, who would dominate Italian warfare for the next 2 centuries. The aftermath of the battle had political consequences that rippled across the region for years. The Ghibelline faction in Emilia-Romagna was strengthened. Bologna's prestige among the Guelph cities suffered. The Pope, John XXII, who had declared Bonacolsi a rebel against the church and offered indulgences to anyone who could harm him, had to reckon with the fact that his rebel had just inflicted a significant defeat on one of the church's most loyal Italian allies. The peace agreement that followed was reasonable in practical terms, but left both sides with outstanding grievances that would fuel the next round of conflict. The Guelph Ghibelline struggle in this region would continue for another 2 centuries, until the Spanish invasion of 1529 brought northern Italy under a new kind of external control, and the old factional divisions became less relevant than the new ones. The bucket remained in Modena. The bucket has been in Modena for so long that it has accumulated its own mythology. There have been at least 2 documented attempts by Bolognese citizens to recover it, both unsuccessful, both celebrated in local lore in different ways. In 1847, a group of Bolognese students allegedly attempted to steal the bucket from the tower during a festival, making it as far as the base of the staircase before being apprehended. Whether this story is entirely true, partly embellished, or largely invented is unclear. Italian civic mythology is a creative genre, but it has the ring of something that people want to be true, and that desire is itself meaningful. There is also the question of whether the bucket currently in the tower is actually the bucket from 1325. 700 years is a long time. Wood deteriorates. Objects get replaced, restored, or quietly substituted when the original becomes too fragile to display. The bucket on display in the Palazzo Comunale is acknowledged to be a replica. What is in the basement of the tower is the original, or so Modena claims. Bologna has no particular reason to trust Modena's account of the bucket's authenticity, and some Bolognese have made a modest industry of questioning whether the trophy is even real. Modena, unsurprisingly, maintains that it is. It remains there still. If you go to Modena today, you can see it, or rather, you can see the replica that is kept in the Palazzo Comunale, the city's town hall. The original is in the basement of the Torre della Ghirlandina. It is, by all accounts, a fairly ordinary-looking wooden bucket. It has no remarkable qualities. It is not large or small or particularly well made. It is a bucket, but it is a bucket that has been in continuous official custody in Modena for approximately 700 years, displayed as a trophy of victory over a neighbor that still, if you ask the right people in either city, generates a certain edge in the conversation. The rivalry between Bologna and Modena is not dead. It has been sublimated, mostly, into the more civilized arenas of Italian regional competition, food, football, civic pride, the ongoing argument about whose local products are better. Bologna is famous for its food, its university, its communist political tradition. Modena is famous for its balsamic vinegar, for Ferrari and Maserati, for the tenor Luciano Pavarotti, and for the bucket. The 2 cities are connected by the Via Emilia, the ancient Roman road that runs the length of Emilia-Romagna, and by decades of economic integration, and by the simple fact of being 40 kilometers apart in a region that has been shared for 2,000 years. They get along fine, mostly. The bucket does not come up in every conversation, but it does come up. The War of the Bucket is a strange and satisfying story because it works on multiple levels at once. On the surface, it is a joke. 2 cities fought a war over a bucket, thousands of men died, and the bucket is still in the wrong city 700 years later. Ha! On a slightly deeper level, it is a story about how medieval Italian city-states worked the factional identities, the accumulated grievances, the specific mechanics of how insults escalated into violence in a world where honor was political currency, and refusing to respond to a provocation was understood as accepting the subordination it implied. And on the deepest level, it is a story about how large conflicts hide behind small objects, how the proximate cause is never the real cause, and how the things that people are willing to die for are often not the things that the dying is really about. There is a version of this story in which the bucket is purely symbolic, and the real war was about territory and power and the accumulated grievances of 2 centuries. And that is the version that historians generally prefer. There is another version in which the bucket is also real, in which the specific act of taking it, displaying it, refusing to return it, and hanging it in a tower for 700 years is itself a meaningful act that tells us something true about how human communities work. Both versions are correct. The bucket was not the cause of the war, but the bucket was also not nothing. It was the object through which the war found its permanent meaning, the thing that made it memorable, the reason a 17th century satirist found it worth 300 verses, and a 19th century composer found it worth an opera, and a 21st century podcast found it worth an episode. Wars are fought for many reasons. They are remembered for one. Bologna wanted its bucket back. It still does. It will probably never get it. In the meantime, it is a great story. That's what Strange Epochs is. Stories that have no clean endings. Moments that history recorded but never quite explained. Events that happened, undeniably happened, and yet still somehow feel impossible. Everything you heard in this episode is real. Every name, every date, every detail drawn from documented historical sources. All of the sources for this episode are listed in the episode description below. I encourage you to look them up. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow Strange Epochs wherever you listen. New episodes drop every Tuesday. And if you want to help the show grow, leaving a review goes a long way. It really does. I'll see you next week. I'm Sean Spainhour. This is Strange Epochs.